Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where we've got a very deep and important discussion here today at Vaughan Manor. You know, on my dopey channel, we always talk about really deep and important things. So here we are at it once again. The rules for reading. Are there rules for reading? Well, let's get into this very important topic, which was inspired by a couple of videos I saw recently, one by CriminOlly about whether classics should be good or need to be good. A couple of things that he talked about in there, and Steve Donoghue did a response to my 12 books or 12 classics that you must read video that I did a couple weeks back. And the title of that is, of course, ridiculous, you know, because there's no book that you must read. But as Steve said in that video, strongly recommend. Those were 12 classics that I would strongly recommend that you read. But as to the rules of reading, are there rules of reading and should there be rules for reading? It seems like a question that has an obvious answer. No. Because you are a free person and you can do whatever the heck you want to do. Now that, I will acknowledge, is a fact. Of course you can. You are free to do what you want, to read what you want, to read as much as you want. However, I do believe there is one hard and firm rule as far as this is concerned. And there are many who would disagree with me on this, but I'm just going to go ahead and stick to my guns and say it because this is something I believe to be true. You should read. If you can read, you should read. That is the only real rule that I would think that you would have for reading. And I believe it to be true. If you can read, you should read. You would be better off. You'd be better off reading than not reading. And that is the only thing I would say, except that, of course, we all have our own kind of rules for reading and the way we read if we are readers. I have a few of my own, which I'll talk about. And I'll talk about, you know, how this might differ from other people. For one thing, I read every day, if I can, if it's possible. It almost always is. I have some time, usually, even if it's at the beginning or the end of the day, even if I've worked who knows how long, doing who knows what, I always find time to read even a little bit, even if it's only a page of whatever I'm reading. I read every day. That is a rule which I think is a good one. I think it's beneficial. And if you can stick to that, I recommend it. This is a recommendation. If you can read every day if you can. Now, for some people, that's just impossible. But it's something I recommend if it's possible for you. Now, what about what you read? Are there any rules for what you read? Not really. I think, you know, you should, as a reader, decide for yourself what you want to read. As long as you're reading, I think you're doing all right. I knew a fella who read every day until he died. And what he read every day, he only read one thing every day, and that was his local newspaper. He read it every day, from the front to the back. He read everything in the paper. Business section, ads, everything. He went through it all. He read everything in his local paper. Every day he read it. It was kind of a ritual for him. He was a reader, but that's what he read, his paper. He read books once in a while, but not a heck of a lot of them, especially if you compare him to some of us on BookTube. But he did read every day, and he was very informed on things. So he was a reader. That was what he did. That was his rule. There's nothing wrong with that. That is fine. You should read what you want to read. Although, depending on what you read, I might recommend changing it up a little bit, just as a reader recommendation. As somebody who has read every day for decades, I would recommend that you might want to change it up now and again. If you only read heavy, serious literature, maybe you want to lighten it up now and again. It would be good for you. And if you only read, stuff that we would have read in Garbaugust last month, if that's all you ever read, that's fine. But I would recommend, maybe shake it up a little bit. Maybe throw something different in there. Maybe challenge yourself a little bit. Which leads me on to the next topic in the rules for reading. I don't have a lot of rules for reading, but one of them is read every day. And the other one is I do not DNF books. That is, do not finish, for those of you who don't watch BookTube all the time. DNF, do not finish. We all have different ideas about this, about whether we DNF, when we do, if we do, and even whether we should. Of course, the should part of it is up to you. I don't DNF at all. If I tried to DNF, my flames would shoot out of my ears. I literally can't do it. It's a physical impossibility. I've tried it. I'm sure it's possible. There were only 2 books within the last couple of years I've really even had the urge to DNF. One of them was The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner, which is a very challenging book, was not a particularly enjoyable read. And when I got to a certain point, nearly halfway through it, I'm just like, man, this is driving me crazy. I don't know what's going on in half of this book. I walked into this book cold with no preparation, not realizing how difficult, deliberately difficult, that evil Faulkner made his book. It's a difficult book if you don't know how it's written going in. But I kind of figured it out halfway through, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. It's different viewpoints going on at different times. All right. And I kind of figured that out, and so I had to go back, and I read the whole thing, of course, because I don't DNF a book, but I was tempted. I'm glad I didn't, though, even though it was not a particularly enjoyable reading experience. In fact, I can't say I enjoyed that book at all. However, I'm glad I read it. It was of value. The experience was difficult, but it was an experience that I think had value. Because it was not a bad book. It was probably a great book. People are probably right about that book and saying it's great. Probably. I can see why people feel that way. And I think it was a worthwhile endeavor. I mean, it's not a terribly long book, so it wasn't a huge investment in time, just in mental energy, which is part of reading challenging books. The other book was completely different that I almost DNF'd, and that was a Star Trek The Next Generation book that I read for Book Trek 2021, which was the first Star Trek The Next Generation novel called Ghost World, I think. And it was just not good. It was just bad. It was just a bad book. And it was just so mediocre that I felt like if I had stopped reading it at any point, it would have been no great loss. Unlike The Sound and the Fury, this book, I felt, had no real value to me that I would have lost by not finishing it. However, I did finish it, of course, because I do not DNF books. Part of that, I think, is because I don't want, a book, no matter how bad, to defeat me. I will not be defeated by a book. And partly because I don't think you can really judge a book by, if you quit at any point in a book and you don't finish the whole thing, if you don't read a whole book, then you haven't read the book. You've read part of the book, but you haven't read the book. And so you can't really judge it completely. You need to go through the whole thing. You need to judge it on the whole of the book. Now, perhaps that doesn't matter when you're reading Star Trek The Next Generation #1 Ghost World, or Ghost Ship or whatever the hell it was. It would have been no great loss to my life if I had DNF'd that, but I'm glad I didn't. I'm actually glad I don't DNF books. But this does raise some questions. This is something you have to decide for yourself. There are rules for reading. We each one of us as readers, we have them. And sometimes these rules change. But we make up these rules as readers for ourselves. You might feel differently about DNFing. And I was watching CriminOlly's video, and he's talked very often about DNFing. He's a big proponent of DNFing. DNF! If you get to the point where you're just not enjoying yourself, just let that sucker go. Give it up and move on to some other crappy book. You know, he's a big proponent, where I am kind of the opposite. And while I would not presume to tell you what you should do, because it is your decision, I would strongly urge you, this is my strong suggestion, to DNF less, to be less willing, to be more persistent in your reading, to accept certain books at least as challenges and not just something that you're just here, because not all books are just fun books. I read a book recently, The Valley of the Flame by Henry Kuttner. You would not DNF this book, by the way, because this book is fun. This book is a good time, highly enjoyable. If you did DNF this book, though, would it be a great loss? I mean, there wasn't a ton that was original in this book, but like I said, it was a good time. It was very enjoyable. I'm glad I read it. I like Henry Kuttner. I also like C.L. Moore, who had a hand in this, I'm certain. But if it had been DNF'd, would it be a great loss? Well, that's up to you, I guess. But there are books that you know going in are going to be more challenging for various reasons, but you might want to read them anyway. And of course, those very often would be either books with serious subjects. Maybe it's about the Nazis or something, and you know this is not going to be a fun time reading it, but you know this book, well, not this book, but that book, that hypothetical book I'm talking about, would be challenging, but it would also have value because it would tell you things that are very important to know. There are a lot of books that are nonfiction on dark or troubling subjects that are like that. They might be challenging, they might not be good times to read, they might even be really long, but they are of value. They're valuable books. They will be valuable to you as a person to read them. The knowledge you will gain is important. So certainly with those books, I would urge you to be, if you choose to read them, and that of course is your choice, I would urge you to be persistent, to not give up. Read the whole book, whatever that book might be. You don't have to follow this advice, of course. You're a free person, but I would urge you to be less willing to DNF a book like that. Also, moving into classic books, some classic books, first of all, are going to be more challenging than others. I have a classic book right here, which is really, really good. This is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. This book is awesome. Day of the Triffids by Wyndham. This is a classic science fiction book. It's not terribly challenging. It's a very good book. And it's probably a book that is entertaining enough and riveting enough that you wouldn't even be tempted to DNF it. But there are books out there which are more challenging and that perhaps you would be more willing to DNF or more tempted. Let's take War and Peace. I actually think this is one of those books that once you get started on it, you probably wouldn't right away actually think to DNF, because really, this is a really good book and it's pretty engrossing. But there are moments in it where you might be like, oh man, this is losing me, right? because this book is very, very long. And there's a big chunk of it at the end, which is just all Tolstoy's philosophy on war and history, and the history of war. That really isn't part of the story or the narrative that you've been reading all of this time. So you might get to that point and think, well, maybe I should just skip it. Don't. Because remember what I said now. You didn't read the book if you don't read the whole thing. This is a very long, very challenging book, but it's a worthwhile book. This is one of those books I would strongly suggest you stick with. You hang on. You be persistent. Right? If you choose to read this, if you walk into a book like War and Peace, you know there are going to be challenges. Right? It's not going to be smooth sailing perhaps the whole way. Stick with it. This book has value. I would say much the same about Les Mis. This might not in some ways be on the level of War and Peace as a book, but in other ways, perhaps it's at an even higher level. Maybe. One thing has to be said about Les Mis, though, by Victor Hugo. This damn thing is huge. And there are long, long sections of this book which have nothing to do with the story at all. I mean at all. I mean nothing. But there are long, huge digressions in here that you just like, you get to them and you're like, damn, why is this even in this book? Should I just skip this part? No, it's part of the book. It's part of Victor Hugo's book, and if you skip it, you haven't read his book. If you read an abridgment of War and Peace or Les Mis, you haven't read War and Peace or Les Mis. I'm just letting you know. You've read part of it, but you haven't read the book. Victor Hugo, for his own strange reasons, wanted that stuff to be in there. And so it's in there, and it's part of the book. And I would, again, strongly urge you to persevere. Read this book. Read the whole book. Stick to it. It's valuable. It will have value, I believe, to you if you read it. I mean, you might hate it. It's okay to hate books that are classics. It's okay to hate any book or dislike any book or think a book is boring or whatever. But if you walk into a book like Les Mis, know what you're walking into. First of all, you're walking into something like that. This is going to be a challenging book. Accept the challenge. Don't DNF it. Hang in there. That's my advice. Of course you can. I mean, you can get to page 10 or you can get to page 300 and you can just bail. That's up to you. Like I said, there are rules to reading, but you make the rules. They're your rules. All I can do is give you some strong recommendations and suggestions, which is what I've done. But ultimately, the rules to reading are up to you. Your reading life is yours. And any one of us who are on one of these channels and are telling you, oh, you should do this, or you must do this, or you have to do this, or even I strongly suggest you do this, you can listen to what we say, take the advice you want to take, and leave what you want to leave, because ultimately it's up to you. There is no wrong way to read, as long as you read. And that's all I have to say, and I will catch you next time.